Lady Deborah da Costa was 21 years old, and in the eyes of her family, she had already failed at being born. There was no curse in her bloodline, only the cold arithmetic of illegitimacy. Her father claimed she was legitimate, of course. He had to. But the whispers in drawing rooms told a different story, one where a hasty marriage couldn't quite cover the timing of her birth, one where her very existence threatened an inheritance, one where silence was the only currency that could buy her survival. That was why her father had panicked when the letters came from creditors. That was why he had sold her north to the Duke of Alsford, Duke Rowan Smith, a stranger whose reputation preceded him like winter fog. Cold, unyielding, untouchable. If you've ever watched someone be silenced and did nothing, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because stories like Deborah's only survive when people choose to listen. Also download your free ebook titled 12 Short Tales of Lost Woman and Unexpected Love by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Her father called it a mercy, as if marriages were rescues and not burials, as if the Duke hadn't specifically requested a bride who would make no demands and ask no questions. The contract had been explicit. She would arrive veiled, speak only when addressed, and accept whatever terms the Duke set forth. Deborah had been given no choice in the matter. She had been given instructions. She had 1 week before the wedding, 1 week to practice walking without trembling, 1 week to memorize the rules her father recited every morning like prayers. Do not ask questions, do not show emotion, do not reveal your face until he commands it. 1 week to become the sort of bride a duke could accept without regret. Deborah stood in the shadowed corridor of her family's crumbling estate, tightening her grip on the veil draped across her arm. The air smelled of damp stone and dying roses. Her younger sister, Margaret, appeared in the doorway, her face pale and pinched. "Deborah," Margaret whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Father is looking for you. He says you must practice the ceremony again. He says you keep forgetting to lower your eyes." Deborah's chest tightened. "I haven't forgotten." "Then why does he keep shouting?" "Because I looked at him," Deborah thought bitterly. "Because for 1 moment I forgot I wasn't supposed to exist." Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to something fragile and afraid. "Is it true what they say about the Duke? That he never speaks to his staff? That he keeps his manor locked like a prison?" "Margaret, they say he only agreed to marry you because father offered to erase his debts." Margaret's eyes glistened. "They say he doesn't even want a wife. Just silence." Deborah felt the words like stones dropping into her stomach. Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the hall. "Deborah!" Her father appeared at the far end of the corridor, his face flushed with drink and desperation. He moved toward her with the frantic energy of a man watching his last chance slip through his fingers. "You will ruin this," he hissed, grabbing her wrist. "Do you understand? 1 mistake, 1 moment of defiance, and he will send you back, and if he sends you back, we lose everything." "Father, please." His grip tightened. "You will be silent, you will be obedient, you will be nothing until he decides otherwise." Margaret gasped. "Father, you're hurting her." He released Deborah so suddenly she stumbled backward. For a moment, the corridor was silent except for the distant creak of settling wood. Then he straightened his coat, smoothed his expression into something falsely calm, and gestured toward the parlor. "The seamstress is waiting," he said coolly. "Your veil needs adjusting. It must cover your face completely. No one is to see you until the Duke permits it." Deborah nodded mechanically, her wrist still throbbing. As she turned to follow, Margaret caught her hand, just for a second, and squeezed. It was the smallest gesture, the only kindness she had left. The wedding was set to take place in the cathedral at Alsford, 3 days' journey north. Deborah would travel alone, accompanied only by a maid who had been instructed not to speak to her. The morning she left, her father walked her to the carriage. He did not embrace her. He did not wish her well. He simply adjusted her veil one final time, pulling it lower over her face until the world became a blur of grey lace. "Remember," he said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. "You're not going to be seen. You're going to disappear." The carriage door closed. The wheels began to turn, and Deborah realized, with a cold and certain clarity, that she was not being sent to become a wife. She was being sent to be erased. The cathedral loomed ahead like a monument to everything she was about to lose. Deborah had been prepared for cold stone, for silence, for judgment. She had not been prepared for the weight of it, the oppressive watching, the hundreds of eyes she couldn't see but could feel pressing against her veiled face. The maid led her to a small antechamber where she was told to wait. Minutes stretched into hours. No one spoke to her. No one explained the delay. Finally, the heavy doors opened. The priest appeared, his face unreadable. "It is time." Deborah's hands trembled as she stood. The veil felt like a shroud. She was led down the aisle slowly, deliberately, as if she were a ghost being escorted to her own funeral. The guests did not whisper. They stared. She could feel their eyes dissecting her posture, her gait, the way her hands clutched the fabric of her gown too tightly. At the altar, there was no groom. Deborah's heart stuttered. The priest gestured for her to stand and wait. So she did, and waited, and waited. The silence became unbearable. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the vaulted ceiling like a death knell. Deborah didn't turn. She had been told not to turn, but she felt him. The air changed. The temperature dropped. Duke Rowan Smith stepped into place beside her. She couldn't see him through the veil, only the dark shape of him, tall, solid, impossibly still. The priest began the vows. Deborah's breath came shallow and fast. She tried to focus on the words, on the rhythm, on anything other than the crawling sensation of being studied. Then the Duke moved. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply stopped. The priest faltered. "Your Grace?" Silence. Deborah's pulse hammered in her throat. Then Rowan's voice, low, cold, and devastatingly deliberate, cut through the chapel like a sharp object. "Lift the veil." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the pews. The priest stammered. "Your Grace, the ceremony. Tradition dictates—" "I said lift it." Deborah's hands went numb. No one moved. The Duke turned his head just slightly toward her. "Now." The priest looked to her father, seated in the front row, his face drained of color. Her father said nothing, because there was nothing he could say. Deborah understood in that moment that this was the test. The Duke wasn't asking to see her face. He was asking if she had ever been allowed to choose to be seen. Her fingers shook as she reached for the veil. The lace felt impossibly heavy. She hesitated, then, slowly, terrifyingly, she lifted it herself. The chapel held its breath. And for the first time in her life, Deborah da Costa looked directly into the eyes of the man who was supposed to own her. He didn't look away. He looked stricken, as if he had been expecting someone else entirely, as if he knew her, and worst of all, as if he had been waiting for her. The veil dropped back over Deborah's face. Her father's hand, steady, iron firm, had lowered it himself the moment the Duke's stricken expression registered. Too fast for anyone else to see clearly. Fast enough to pretend the interruption had never happened. "A misunderstanding, Your Grace," her father said smoothly, his voice carrying across the stone. "The light plays tricks. We shall proceed." But the Duke had already turned away. Without a word, Rowan Smith walked back down the aisle, his footsteps deliberate and final. The cathedral doors closed behind him with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. Deborah stood frozen at the altar, her hands trembling beneath the lace of her gloves. The priest shifted uncomfortably. The guests murmured in low, scandalized tones that slithered through the pews like smoke. Her father's grip found her elbow, gentle to observers, bruising to her. "Smile," he hissed into her ear. "This is a delay, not a disaster. He will return." But he will return. His fingers dug deeper. "And when he does, you will say nothing. You will do nothing, do you understand?" "You?" Deborah nodded, the movement barely perceptible beneath her veil. Her father released her and turned to address the guests with practiced charm, his voice rich with apology and assurance. Something about the Duke's demanding schedule, something about formalities, something about tradition being honored in due time. Deborah stopped listening. She became aware, suddenly and completely, of how many people were watching her, not watching for her, watching at her as if she were an object whose value was still being appraised. She could feel their eyes cataloguing her posture, her stillness, the way she held her bouquet too tightly. They weren't whispering about the Duke's exit. They were whispering about whether she had caused it. "Must have done something." Father looked furious. Perhaps she's deformed beneath that veil. Deborah's chest constricted. The cathedral felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward. The stained glass windows filtered the light into fractured colors that made everything look like a bruise. Her father returned to her side, his smile fixed and hollow. "He has requested a private audience before the ceremony continues," he murmured. "He is particular about protocol." Deborah's heart lurched. "What does that mean?" "It means," her father said, his tone edged with warning, "that you will speak only if spoken to. You will answer truthfully but briefly, and you will remember that our entire future depends on this marriage proceeding. Father, you don't need to understand. You need to obey." Minutes dragged into an hour. Then, 2. The guests grew restless. Deborah remained standing, her legs aching, her breath shallow beneath the veil. She wondered if the Duke had left entirely, if this was his way of rejecting her without the scandal of a public refusal. She wondered if she had already failed at being invisible. Then the doors opened. The whispers ceased instantly. Rowan Smith entered the cathedral for the second time, and the temperature seemed to drop with him. He moved with the quiet, unyielding presence of a man who did not ask for space. He simply occupied it. He walked directly to the altar. This time he did not look at the priest. He did not look at her father. His gaze settled on Deborah and did not move. Rowan had seen her face for only 3 seconds. It had been enough. He stood at the altar now, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. But his mind was racing, turning over a memory he had buried years ago and thought he would never have to exhume. A girl, 14, maybe 15, standing in the rain outside her father's estate while men shouted inside. Her face pale, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from understanding too much, too young. He had been there on business, collecting a debt her father owed his late uncle. He'd watched her through the window, shivering and forgotten, while her father raged about scandal and legitimacy and bloodlines that couldn't be trusted. Rowan had left that night thinking he would never see her again. He had been wrong. He studied her now, this woman who stood veiled and silent before him like a ghost in white. Her posture was too rigid, not the practiced poise of a lady trained in etiquette, but the frozen stillness of someone who had learned that any movement could be a mistake. Her hands trembled beneath her gloves, the bouquet shaking just slightly, enough that the petals quivered. And when the priest had asked if she came of her own free will, she had not answered immediately. She had hesitated, looked toward her father, waited for permission to speak. That hesitation told Rowan everything. The priest cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "Shall we proceed, Your Grace?" Rowan didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the veiled figure before him. He could see the faint outline of her profile through the lace, the way her breath came too fast, the way she held herself as if bracing for impact. "Lady Deborah," he said quietly. She flinched at the sound of her name. "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice was barely audible, thin and careful. "Are you unwell?" A pause. "No, Your Grace." "Then why are you trembling?" Another pause, longer this time. I'm nervous, Your Grace." "Nervous," Rowan repeated, his tone flat. "Or afraid?" The cathedral went deathly silent. Her father shifted in the front pew, his jaw tightening. Deborah's voice cracked when she spoke. "I am honored to be here, Your Grace." It was the most hollow thing Rowan had ever heard. He looked past her to her father, whose face had gone carefully blank. The man met his gaze without flinching, but Rowan saw the calculation behind his eyes, the quiet desperation of someone who had gambled everything on this moment. Rowan turned back to Deborah. She was shaking harder now. The priest began the vows, his voice droning through the ancient words with mechanical precision. Rowan let him continue for a few lines, watching the way Deborah's shoulders curled inward, the way her head bowed lower with each passing second. She looked like she was disappearing. And suddenly, Rowan couldn't tolerate it. He had watched too many women be erased by men who called it duty. He had stood by once before and done nothing, and it had cost an innocent woman her life. He would not stand by again. The priest reached the part about sacred union and eternal vows. Rowan raised his hand. "Stop!" The word cut through the cathedral like a blade. The priest froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Deborah's head snapped up, and Rowan stepped closer, his voice low and unshakable. "Before we proceed," he said, his eyes locked on hers through the veil, "I have a question for the bride." Her father stood abruptly. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular." "Sit down." The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Her father sat. Rowan turned back to Deborah, and for the first time since entering the cathedral, he allowed his expression to soften, just barely. "Lady Deborah," he said, "I need you to answer me honestly." She nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Do you want this marriage?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Deborah opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her throat had closed completely, her mind spinning through every warning her father had drilled into her. Do not speak unless spoken to. But she had been spoken to. Do not reveal weakness, but she was drowning in it. Do not give him reason to refuse you. But what if the refusal was mercy? Her voice cracked. "I was sent, Your Grace." The words escaped before she could stop them, raw and truthful and damning. Rowan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of confirmation he had suspected. Now he knew. He turned to the priest, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. "Lift the veil." The cathedral erupted in whispers. The priest paled. "Your Grace, tradition dictates that the veil remains until after." "I am aware of tradition." Rowan's tone was ice. "Lift it." The priest looked desperately toward Deborah's father, whose face had gone from shock to fury in the span of a heartbeat. But her father couldn't object. Not publicly, not without revealing exactly why he needed the veil to stay in place. Deborah felt the walls closing in. Every lesson, every warning, every threat her father had whispered crashed down on her at once. "If he sees you too soon, if he knows the truth, if you fail." The priest reached toward her with trembling hands. Deborah stepped back instinctively. "No," she whispered. The priest froze. Rowan's gaze sharpened. "No." She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her hands moved to the veil, gripping the lace with numb fingers. If someone else lifted it, she was a thing being unveiled. a possession being inspected. But if she lifted it herself? Her father's voice rang out from the pews, tight with barely controlled panic. "Deborah, don't!" It wasn't a warning, it was a command. And for the first time in her life, Deborah da Costa chose to disobey. Her hands shook violently as she grasped the edge of the veil. The lace felt impossibly delicate, as if the entire world balanced on this single piece of fabric. She hesitated for one agonizing moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted it. The veil fell away. The cathedral held its breath. Deborah raised her eyes and looked directly at the Duke of Ulsford. He didn't look away. He didn't look satisfied. He looked devastated, as if seeing her face had confirmed something terrible, as if he had hoped, against all reason, to be wrong. His jaw tightened, his hands clasped behind his back, clenched into fists. "It is you," he said quietly, almost to himself. Deborah's chest constricted. "Your Grace?" But Rowan wasn't speaking to her anymore. He was staring at her father, and the look in his eyes was murderous. "You knew," Rowan said, his voice dangerously soft. "You knew exactly who she was." Her father stood slowly, his mask of composure cracking. "Your Grace, I assure you, you assured me nothing." Rowan took a step forward, and the entire cathedral seemed to recoil from the fury radiating off him. "You told me she was willing. You told me she understood the arrangement. You told me she had no ties to—" He stopped himself, his gaze snapping back to Deborah. She stood frozen, her unveiled face exposed to hundreds of watching eyes, her mind racing to understand what was happening. "You remember me," Rowan said. It wasn't a question, but his eyes searched hers desperately, as if hoping she would. Deborah shook her head slowly. I don't—" Something broke in his expression. He turned to the priest, his voice final and absolute. "This ceremony will not continue." The words detonated through the cathedral like cannon fire. Gasps, shouts. Her father, lunging forward, stopped only by the row of pews between them. Rowan looked at Deborah one last time, and the devastation in his eyes made her chest ache. "I cannot marry a woman," he said quietly, "who was never given a choice. If this moment made your chest tighten, imagine how many women never get seen at all. Subscribe, because silence thrives when stories stop being told." The cathedral exploded into chaos. Guests rose from their seats, voices overlapping in scandalized confusion. The priest stammered something about protocol, about the sanctity of contracts, about arrangements already made and witnessed. Rowan ignored all of it. He stood perfectly still, his attention fixed solely on Deborah, who remained frozen at the altar with her veil pooled at her feet like fallen armor. "Lady Deborah," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision, "I need you to answer one question." Her father's voice boomed from the front pew. "Your Grace, this is unconscionable. The contracts have been signed, the agreements finalized. I did not ask you." Rowan didn't even glance in her father's direction. His eyes remained locked on Deborah's. "I asked her." The cathedral fell silent again, the kind of silence that felt like held breath. Deborah's pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her exposed face, could feel the weight of expectation pressing down like stone. Her father's fury radiated from behind her, a living thing that promised consequences. But Rowan was asking her a question. No one had ever asked her a question that mattered. "Do you come to this marriage willingly?" Rowan's voice was gentler now, almost careful. "Not because you were told to, not because you were sent, but because you choose to be here." The question itself was obscene. Gasps rippled through the pews. A woman in the third row clutched her chest as if witnessing blasphemy. Even the priest looked appalled. Brides were not asked such things. Marriages were arrangements, contracts, alliances. Will had nothing to do with it, But Rowan stood there, waiting as if her answer was the only thing in the world that mattered. Deborah opened her mouth, closed it, her hands twisted in the fabric of her gown. She thought of her father's warnings, his threats, the bruises on her wrist that still hadn't faded. She thought of the word sent, and how perfectly it captured everything she had ever been. Her voice was barely a whisper. I was sent. The words landed like stones in still water, the ripples spreading outward in waves of shock. Someone in the back gasped. Another murmured prayers. Her father's face drained of all color. Deborah's voice grew stronger, steadier, even as her hands shook. I was sent because my father's debts required payment. I was sent because silence was easier than scandal. I was sent because no one asked if I wanted to go. Her eyes burned, but she refused to look away from Rowan. I do not know you, Your Grace. I do not know what you want from me, but I know I did not choose to be here. The truth hung between them, raw and irrevocable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Rowan's expression hardened into something cold and resolved. He turned slowly, deliberately, toward the front pew, toward her father. Lord DaCosta, he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. You and I need to speak. Lord DaCosta rose from his seat, his composure hanging by a thread. Your Grace, if we could discuss this privately. No. Rowan's voice was granite. You've had privacy long enough. You've had silence long enough. He descended from the altar, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like a predator closing distance. The guests parted instinctively as he passed. You came to me 6 months ago, Rowan said, his voice carrying through the cathedral. You offered your daughter in exchange for the erasure of substantial debts. You assured me she was willing, that she understood the terms. Lord DaCosta's jaw tightened. She is willing. She just told you she was sent. Rowan stopped 3 paces from him. There is a difference between consent and compliance, Lord DaCosta. You know this. You've simply chosen to ignore it. This is a private family matter. It stopped being private the moment you brought her here under false pretenses. Rowan's eyes were cold as winter stone. You told me she had no living mother, no siblings who would contest the match, no scandals attached to her name. Deborah's breath caught. No living mother? Her father's face went pale. Your Grace, I can explain. Can you? Rowan's voice dropped to something dangerous. Can you explain why, when I made inquiries after our first meeting, I discovered your daughter's birth certificate was amended 3 times? Can you explain the sealed court records, the payments made to silence witnesses? The cathedral erupted in whispers. Deborah stood frozen at the altar, her mind reeling. Amended certificates, sealed records. What was he talking about? Her father's composure finally shattered. You had no right to investigate. I had every right. Rowan's voice cut like steel. You were offering me a bride whose very existence is built on lies, a daughter you've spent 21 years trying to legitimize, not out of love, but out of fear that someone would discover the truth. What truth? Deborah's voice rang out before she could stop herself. The question silenced the room. Rowan turned to her, and for the first time since the ceremony began, his expression softened with something that looked like pity. Your mother didn't die in childbirth, he said quietly. She died 3 years ago, in an asylum your father committed her to when you were 6 months old. The words struck Deborah like a physical blow. No, she whispered. No, he said what he needed you to believe. Rowan's gaze returned to her father. Because if you knew the truth, if you knew your mother was alive and imprisoned, you might have asked questions. You might have fought back. Lord DaCosta lunged forward. You sanctimonious bastard! 2 of Rowan's men appeared from the shadows, blocking his path. Rowan stepped past him without a glance, moving back toward the altar, toward Deborah. "This marriage," he announced to the assembled guests, his voice ringing with authority, "is invalid under Alsford law. A union entered under coercion, built on deception, and conducted without true consent holds no legal standing in my house." He looked at Deborah, his expression unreadable. "You are free to go, Lady Deborah, or you are free to stay. But the choice, for the first time in your life, is yours." The cathedral emptied in waves of scandal and speculation. Guests flooded toward the exits, their voices rising in a cacophony of shock and judgment. Some cast pitying glances at Deborah. Others looked at her with naked curiosity, as if she were a mystery finally solved. Most simply fled, eager to be the first to spread the story. Her father was escorted out by Rowan's men, still shouting threats and protests that echoed off the stone walls until the heavy doors closed behind him. Then, silence. Deborah stood alone at the altar, her unveiled face exposed, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the communion rail to stay upright. She wasn't triumphant. She was shattered. Everything she had believed about herself, about her life, about her mother, all of it had been lies. Beautiful, careful lies designed to keep her compliant, grateful, silent. And now the silence was gone, and she didn't know what remained beneath it. Footsteps approached from behind. "Lady Deborah." Rowan's voice was quiet now, stripped of the authority he'd wielded moments before. He sounded almost uncertain. She didn't turn around. "Is it true? About my mother?" "Yes." The single word broke something inside her. A sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had cried enough in her life. She wouldn't cry now. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Her voice was raw. "Why wait until—" "Because I needed proof." Rowan moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain distance. "And because I needed to know if you were part of the deception or a victim of it." Deborah turned to face him, anger flaring through the grief. "You thought I was lying. I thought you might be protecting him." His eyes met hers, unflinching. "Some daughters do. I'm not some daughters. I know that now." They stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing between them. Finally, Deborah found her voice again. "You said you recognized me, that you knew who I was." Rowan nodded slowly. "7 years ago, I came to your father's estate to collect a debt. You were standing outside in the rain, alone, forgotten." His jaw tightened. "I heard your father inside, raging about legitimacy and bloodlines, about a daughter who was a liability he couldn't afford." Deborah's chest tightened. She had no memory of that day, but she had many memories of being left in the rain. "I left," Rowan continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I told myself it wasn't my concern, that families had their private struggles." He looked away. "2 months later, I learned what your father had done to your mother. By then, it was too late." "Too late for what?" "To save her." His hands clenched at his sides. "I swore I wouldn't make that mistake again, that if I ever had the chance to stop a man like your father, I would." Understanding dawned slowly, painfully. "So you agreed to marry me," Deborah said quietly. "Not because you wanted a wife, but because you wanted to expose him." "Yes." Rowan didn't flinch from the accusation. "And no, that's not an answer. It's the only one I have." He turned to face her fully. "I agreed to the marriage to gather evidence, but I delayed the ceremony because I needed to know if you were complicit or trapped, and I stopped it because—" He hesitated. "Because you deserve more than to be anyone's transaction." Deborah's anger wavered, replaced by something more complicated. Gratitude, resentment, confusion. "What happens now?" she asked. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You have a choice. I can arrange for you to be escorted anywhere you wish. Away from your father, away from me, away from all of this, or—" He met her eyes. "You can stay, not as my wife, not as my obligation, but as my guest, until you decide what you want." "Time," Deborah whispered. "Yes." Rowan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Time." Deborah stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was true. Not because she feared her father's retribution, though that was also true. She stayed because Rowan had offered her something no one ever had. Time without conditions. The Duke's manor was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't cold or austere. It was lived in, comfortable, filled with books and light. Her rooms overlooked a garden where roses bloomed despite the late season, their petals blood-red against the grey stone walls. She was given freedom she didn't know how to use. No one told her when to wake, when to eat, what to wear. The servants asked her preferences instead of dictating them, and the first time a maid asked what she wanted for breakfast, Deborah had stared at her in blank confusion. I don't know," she'd whispered. The maid had smiled kindly. "Then we'll bring you options, my lady, and you can decide." Decide. Such a small word, such an impossible concept. Rowan kept his distance at first. He didn't press her for conversation, didn't demand gratitude or explanations. He simply existed in the same space, allowing her to adjust at her own pace. It was in the library that Deborah finally spoke to him first. She'd found him reading by the window, afternoon light casting shadows across his face. He looked different here, less like the Duke who had commanded a cathedral, more like a man carrying weight he couldn't set down. "Why did you really stop the wedding?" Her voice was soft but steady. Rowan looked up, surprise flickering across his features. Then he closed his book and set it aside. "Because I've seen what happens when women are treated as currency," he said quietly. "My mother was sold to my father to settle a dispute. She passed away hating him, hating herself, hating me for being born." Deborah's breath caught. "I swore I would never be part of that system," Rowan continued, "and then your father offered me exactly that, a woman as payment. I thought if I accepted, I could at least ensure you weren't harmed. But when I saw you at that altar—" He paused. "I realized ensuring you weren't harmed wasn't enough. You deserved to choose." Deborah moved closer, sitting in the chair opposite him. "I've never been asked what I want. I'm asking now." The words hung between them, gentle and terrifying. Deborah looked down at her hands, hands that had held toxic flowers, worn gloves to hide bruises, gripped veils meant to erase her. "I want to know who my mother was," she said finally. "Not the version my father created. The real woman." Rowan nodded. "I have records. Letters she wrote before she was committed. I can give them to you. I want to learn to ride horses without someone telling me I'll fall. The stables are yours. I want to speak without measuring every word." "Then speak." Deborah looked up, meeting his eyes. "I want to stay here, not as your guest, not as your obligation." She took a shaky breath. "As someone learning who she is when no one's watching." Something shifted in Rowan's expression. Relief, perhaps, or hope. "Then stay," he said simply. Weeks passed. Deborah began filling the silence with her own voice. She asked questions, expressed opinions, argued with Rowan about books and philosophy and whether roses needed pruning in autumn. He listened to every word. Never interrupted, never dismissed, never looked at her the way her father had, as a problem requiring management. He looked at her as if she were real, and slowly, painfully, Deborah began to believe she was. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Rowan spoke without preamble. "You could leave any time," he said. "I want you to know that. This isn't a cage." Deborah stopped walking. The roses around them released their fading perfume into the cool air. I know, she said, and yet you stay. She turned to face him, and for the first time since the cathedral, she smiled, small, uncertain, but real. I stay because I choose to, she said. Not because I must, because I want to. Rowan's expression softened in ways she was just beginning to understand. Then I'm glad, he said quietly. And Deborah realized, standing there in the garden she'd claimed as her own, that she was glad too. If you believe Deborah should have walked away, say it in the comments. If you believe this is where her real strength begins, subscribe now. Silence ends when people choose sides. Her father came on a grey morning in late autumn. Deborah was in the garden when the steward announced him, her hands deep in soil as she helped replant the rose beds for winter. She'd taken to gardening, liked the way earth felt under her fingernails, the way living things responded to care instead of commands. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Send him to the drawing room," she said. "I'll be there shortly." The steward hesitated. "His Grace offered to accompany you, my lady." Deborah shook her head. "No, this is mine to do." Her father looked older, smaller somehow, without the armor of his authority. He rose when she entered, his face carefully arranged into contrition. "Deborah, my dear, girl, don't." Her voice was calm, steady. "Don't call me that," he faltered. "I came to apologize. To explain, there's nothing to explain." Deborah remained standing, her hands folded in front of her. "You sold me to erase your debts. You lied about my mother to keep me compliant. You taught me that my value existed only in my silence. I was trying to protect you." "No." The word rang clear as a bell. "You were protecting yourself from scandal, from consequences, from the truth of what you'd done." Her father's mask slipped, revealing something desperate beneath. "You were always difficult, even as a child. You asked too many questions, felt too much." "I was a child who wanted to be loved," Deborah said quietly, "and you taught me that love was conditional on erasure." Silence filled the space between them. Her father's voice cracked. "What do you want from me?" Deborah met his eyes without flinching. "Nothing. I want nothing from you. Not your approval, not your apology. Not your presence in my life." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that I survived you, and I will spend the rest of my life becoming someone you never allowed me to be." She left him there, standing alone in someone else's drawing room. She didn't look back. Rowan found her by the garden wall, watching the sun break through clouds. He stood beside her in silence for a long moment, then, "How do you feel?" "Free," Deborah said. Then, softer, "Terrified." They often feel the same. She turned to face him, studying the man who had given her back her voice, who had listened when she learned to use it, who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "I have something to ask you," Rowan said, his voice careful. "But you can say no. You can always say no." Deborah's heart quickened. "Ask. Would you consider marrying me?" He raised a hand before she could respond. "Not because of contracts or debts or duty, not because you feel obligated or grateful, but because you choose to." Deborah was quiet, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I have conditions," she said finally. Rowan's lips curved into something almost like a smile. "I would expect nothing less. My voice. I keep my voice, in private and in public. When I disagree, when I'm afraid, when I'm angry, I speak. Always. My autonomy. I make decisions about my own life, my own body, my own future. Without question. And my truth." Deborah's voice strengthened. "I will not hide who I am. Not my history, not my mother, not the fact that I was nearly erased. If people judge me for it, let them." Rowan stepped closer, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Deborah DaCosta," he said quietly, "I would marry you precisely because of your truth, not despite it." She searched his face for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was another transaction dressed as choice. She found none. "Then yes," she whispered. "I choose yes." They married 3 months later in the manor's small chapel, with only the staff as witnesses. No cathedral, no crowds, no veils. Deborah wore a simple dress the color of cream and roses from the garden she'd replanted with her own hands. When the priest asked if she came willingly, she answered without hesitation, "I do." And when Rowan lifted her hand to his lips, she didn't flinch. She smiled. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists. Lastly, download your free ebook titled 12 Short Tales of Lost Woman and Unexpected Love by clicking the link in the pinned comment.